So what I'm going to talk about today is a project that was conducted in collaboration with former students of mine, Megan Papish, who's now at Louisiana State University, and Mike Hout, who you guys I think probably mostly know because he was here for a summer, who's now at New Mexico State. And this is a project really about spoken word recognition and spoken word memory, but using eye tracking measures as a way to understand those processes. And I'm going to go backwards a little bit in time to an issue that's been central to my work for a long time, which are different ways that theoretical views have approached the mental lexicon, collection of words in the mind. And going back as far as Morton's Logogen theory, then to interactive activation models and more modern PDP models, and carrying forward. There's lots of different theories and models out there, but a real common bedrock assumption among most of them is what I call a canonical lexicon. That your knowledge of words resides in memory as a set of essentially abstract units. That word frequency is accumulated by maybe changing a threshold for a different unit, or changing the weights on that node in a network. But essentially, when you hear spoken language, despite the fact that it is rich with perceptual details, I am now speaking in my voice with my register in an American accent in this context, despite all that superficial variation, what is activated in the mind of the listener are abstract representations of words which are quickly integrated into syntax and into discourse. And once the moment has passed, what you remember is the gist of the message and those activated linguistic items, not the superficial items themselves. And so for this kind of system to work, what is typically assumed is what's called a normalization process, where any perceptual noise is dealt with in the moment of perception, it's corrected, and what is activated is sort of that kernel underneath. This kind of a system is very powerful for modeling, and as a scientific theory. It has great stability, it has great power and flexibility, and it has economy of representation. You don't waste a lot of space, either in a theoretical network or in a wet brain. Having said that, in the world of perceptual categorization, there's been a very long-standing debate about the proper form of representation of knowledge. When you have a category such as dog in mind, is it represented by best instances, by prototypes, or by countless exemplars? And as it turns out, in categorization data, exemplar models almost always win. They almost always explain data better, they fit more parsimoniously with fewer free parameters, and by and large, they tend to be the better explanations. And so something that I've talked about for a very long time is that we can benefit from thinking about the mental lexicon as a set of stored episodes. They're not stored permanently. You don't have every instance of every word you've ever heard. But maybe what we do in speech perception is we take in the whole signal. We activate linguistic knowledge, but we don't get rid of the other stuff. It's still there. I like this approach because it has lots of advantages, a couple of which I'll focus on in detail, but systems that store lots of variability tend to be robust to variability. They're not brittle. So it solves the perceptual problem without having to do that normalization. There's a natural connection of perception and memory. The fact of the matter is, when you experience something, whether it's a face or a spoken word, you tend to have episodic recall of that something. You don't just recall the word, you recall its context, and you can imitate people that you've met. You have knowledge of people's voices that you're carrying around in your head. Well, where does it come from? It comes from perception. Why have an extra step? Most importantly, and the reason why exemplar models work, is that they're able to predict abstract phenomena. You can abstract a prototype and get prototype enhancement effects out of a set of exemplars, for example. Getting a little bit more concrete, in lots of domains outside of spoken language, and spoken language is one of these things where it's got a history with linguistics and it's sort of separate from other parts of cognitive psychology, for better or for worse. In non-linguistic domains, we see this all the time, that there's great memory for what I call surface details. Memory for pictures is prodigious and fast. You probably saw the studies that came out recently by Brady, Conkle, and colleagues. People can be exposed to thousands of images and recall them with very little forgetting over long periods of time. Music memory is sort of absolute. People have good memory for absolute pitch. You can tell if things have been changed a tiny bit. If you are in an experiment and items are being shown to you different numbers of times, people are quite good at estimating the frequency with which they saw something. Each individual exposure is sort of cataloged, which is hard to explain if all you're doing is activating an abstract node. And of course, by definition, memory for faces. You all are able to recognize thousands of people, celebrities, friends, acquaintances. Each face has the same basic features. You activate abstract knowledge: white man, Asian female, age, people you know, people you don't know, but you also must be encoding specifics that allow you to discriminate one person from the next. So my core argument for a long time has been, why shouldn't spoken word perception work the same way? Even though I'm talking about memory studies on the last slide, it turns out that if you use perceptual measures of memory, so priming effects, you get really strong evidence that people hold on to details of experiences for a long time. So this is an old study by Carolyn Cave. It was in Psych Science in 1997. She had people come to the lab and simply see a series of pictures, photographs of different objects or landscapes, and just name what was in the picture. So barn, giraffe, pizza, whatever it might be. And they did this for something like 100 trials. And then she had people go home and come back to the lab at some later time. And all they did at that later session was name pictures again. And some of the pictures were ones that they had seen previously, and some were new. And it's impossible to read this graph, and it's a terrible representation. But what you see here are reaction times for naming pictures that are old on the left in every panel, or new on the right. And of course, before you ask, it's flipped so that the pictures that are old for some people are new for others, so it's all nicely counterbalanced. What's hard to see, but most important, is that it goes from a 6-week delay in the upper left-hand corner. That's every one of these panels is a different group of subjects. After 6 weeks, you get a robust priming effect, old versus new. 8 weeks, 10 weeks, 12 weeks, all the way up to 48 weeks. When people don't have real great recognition memory, they can't discriminate old from new very well. But their naming times for these pictures still shows this robust effect. One exposure to a specific stimulus has this long-lasting effect. Why she didn't just wait 4 weeks and make it a year, I'll never know.
Steve, it might be another illusion here, but eyeballing that data, looks like most of the variation is in the new data.
Absolutely.
So how is that?
Well, you're relatively fast. Actually, there's variation.
But it's different in all subjects, right?
It's all different subjects.
Okay.
So every one of these is a different subset of like 12 to 15 people. And it does look like you get some intercept changes. But the difference between the bars is rather stable over time.
Yeah, yeah.
With respect to spoken words, I'm not going to review all this old stuff, but I've long argued that in fact the episodic view, the idea that you encode words and voices together and you store that detailed knowledge and use it in later perception, I've argued for that for a long time. So the challenge is that fluent word perception, especially in connected speech like now, word recognition is fast, robust, and undeniably linguistic. You're activating linguistic knowledge, despite massive variability in the way people speak. You guys probably know all about things like context condition variation, that what sound to us like the same segments in words actually change their physical quality based on who's saying them, where they are, positioned in a word, etc. And so we need to have some system that takes this noisy signal and extracts meaningful variation out of it. But we don't necessarily have to throw away that variation as part of that process. So our perceptual systems have to correct for changes in talkers and in speaking rates and accents and just phonetic stuff. But the fate of those details is what's at issue. Some people argue that they are really never appreciated at all, that I liken it to walking across a crowded campus. As you walk across campus, maybe you're having a conversation with somebody, and there's lots of people in your way, and you negotiate your way around them all, you perceive them, you behave accordingly, and you move on. And if I ask you when you reach your destination, do you recognize this person that you walked by, the odds of you recognizing them are extremely slim. And so that sort of a framework where you deal with the stimulus when it's in context and then it's immediately sort of forgotten is I would say the modal view of what happens in language. That you activate the relative memory structures and then it's gone. But it could be the case that instead of them just fading away entirely, they are stored. Maybe they're stored, but they're not stored as linguistic features, but some other sort of general memory store. Or maybe they're just part of your representation of language in and of itself. I'm going to skip this because I think I've already kind of covered it. The only thing I want to make special note of here is that with both kinds of theories, most people think that episodic theories sound really counterintuitive, that the notion that you're storing all these words seems really wrong. I would like to just take one little moment to make the counter pitch, that in fact, your intuitions are bad both directions. So for abstract theories, it sounds really reasonable, and it fits your intuition that you are able to tell us, you have a conversation with Eric, then later on you say, oh, I talked with Eric earlier, and blah, 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 blah. And they say, well, what exactly did he say? You go, I don't know, but basically he wants you to show up at this time in this place. That's your normal experience, is that you have conversations all day long, you can only remember a handful of them at the end of the day, you know the gist, but you don't really memorize what you experience. That's your intuition. At the same time, I would argue that we all do lots of stuff all the time that really doesn't fit with that abstract theory at all. How many of you have read a note from somebody you know, and you sort of hear that person's voice in your head when you're reading the note? How many of you are able to imitate your friends, or pick up the phone and as soon as your mom says hello, you know it's her, just from one word? Everybody says hello. But you recognize her voice. You've been doing this your whole life. You've been collecting these superficial linguistic memories that you use. You can tell when your friend is upset just by the tone of her voice. It's part of who we are, and for some reason in psycholinguistic theory, it is treated sort of as a separate instance of cognition. So I want to talk about one particular finding. I also want my computer to work. There we go. Voice specificity effects. In any task where a person is hearing a series of spoken words and making some response, whether it's trying to memorize them or categorize them or repeat them back, if the speaker changes from trial to trial to trial, there are costs involved. Accuracy goes down, reaction time goes up, and more important, if in a task a specific item, a specific word in a certain voice is exposed to you or played to you at time 1 and then repeated at some point later at time 2, there are perceptual benefits. you are faster and more accurate, more likely to remember words that share their surface information from study to test. And it's shown in both implicit and explicit memory. These are old data. However, there's been in the literature for the last 10 years or so a counter-argument to my argument. And that's what I want to address head on today and the study that I'm going to tell you. So I'm going to back up for a moment and talk about an alternative theory. This Val is what I was doing today. I was chopping slides out of an old talk and sticking them in here, and I didn't feel like reformatting, so that's my Jedi mind trick. There are some researchers who are friends of mine, Connor McLennan and Paul Luce in particular, who have been making an argument that even though these voice effects that people might encode these episodes, they almost never get used in actual perception. And they make this argument by an appeal to Grossberg's adaptive resonance theory. And I know that adaptive resonance theory isn't super well known. I'm not going to try to do it justice because it's a giant sort of ever-growing theory with hundreds of papers about it. But it's a lot like a PDP model, and I'm just going to give you a couple of basics before I return to what I was talking about. A really brief overview as adaptive resonance applies to speech, and it's really a general model of attention and memory and perception. What Grossberg argues is that whatever you are conscious of when you're having conversation, what you appreciate perceptually and what you could report as conscious awareness is a product of top-down expectations and bottom-up matching processes. But when that process takes place, completely determines what you store as a memory. Putting it in my own earlier words, conscious speech percepts and appreciation of units of different sizes are emergent products of what Grossberg calls resonant brain states. It's really just a feedback loop. You've got stored knowledge, like lexical items in your mind, but also phonemes or idioms, set phrases, certain code words that you share with friends, whatever it might be. You have that stored in memory, and when you get a little bit of speech input, you quickly start trying to match what you have in memory to that input. If you're able to make them sync up really quickly, it forms with a feedback loop where the top-down matching reinforces the incoming signal, the incoming signal reinforces the top-down matching. That is what Grossberg calls a resonance. It falls into this stable loop for a moment, and that loop is the basis of consciousness. And he thinks that this is true for everything that the brain does. So in a version of ARC called ARC Phone, you hear speech. You've got low-level features like plosives and tongue position and vowel height, all those different phonetic features, which quickly activate items in memory. Items activate what are called list chunks. List chunks are just stuff that you store in your life, like words. These can be any combination of things. They could be products of prior learning, such as prototypes. They can be words, but they could also be things like detailed traces. They could be voice-specific traces. If I've heard your voice a lot, I learn your voice. And I'm able to imitate you because I can call upon those products. As noted, once input starts, in this case speech input, this feedback cycle begins. It's a lot like you remember from old PDP models where activation starts to flow up through the interactive activation model, and then units start to get activated and they send back feedback and it resolves, right? Just because I went to all the effort of making this figure once. Van Orden and I once had a paper out where we advanced an adaptive resonance view of printed word perception. And because I'm in Britain, we'll consider the great word pint, which is one of, anyone here working in reading of, not reading connected text, but just word perception? You know that pint is like a favorite word of modelers everywhere. because of course all of its neighbors are pronounced int, so mint, int, lint. If a person is put under a lot of pressure in a naming task and they see the word pint, and they have to like respond by deadline, about a third of the time they'll say pint, and they say pint faster than they can say pint. So we were fascinated by pint, Guy and I. And essentially what happens in a resonance model is something like the following. The word is presented on screen, and let's say you're doing a lexical decision. It immediately activates lots of these little features, but you're not consciously appreciating those features. And it might be things like the sound of the initial letter P, it might be words like pink that it looks like, but it could be semantic stuff like drop, container, whatever. A bunch of stuff is like broadly activated in memory, which gives you things like semantic priming effects. The pronunciation pint is available really early because it fits with the mapping of spelling the sound, and the actual pronunciation pint becomes available a little bit later. But even at that early moment in time, you're forming these feedback loops between the input in pint and the input in pint. If your job was simply to classify words and non-words with really non-word-like letter strings like LDIB as your foils, even at that early level, you'd be able to say it's a real word and classify it already. You don't need to solve whether it's pint or pint to know that it's not one of these weird non-words. However, your perceptual system keeps working, and all sorts of semantic features start to get activated. Semantic features like small and blood and measure and beer are getting activated because they match that letter string. All of those are forming resonances. They're all sending feedback to pint and not to pint, because pint isn't a word. So even though pint is active momentarily, and we can come up with clever experiments to prove that it's active momentarily, you're never aware of it as a reader. When you see pint and you say pint, you have no appreciation that pint was ever an option. Because what happens is all other context supports one interpretation. In a model like adaptive resonance, that forces a feedback loop. Pint falls into resonance with the letter string. All the other stuff is gone, and the only thing you're really aware of is the word itself. At that point, once you've identified it as pint, you can discriminate words from non-words if you had pronounceable non-words like blid. If you were able to say that's pint, and that is a word, you could make that discrimination. It keeps going though. When you see the word pint, you probably 90% of the time think of a pint of beer, maybe you think of a pint of cream, you might think of a unit of blood, but probably whenever you see the word, some interpretation comes to mind. You don't sit there and appreciate all of it, right? Well, whether it's context or frequency, whatever it is that motivates your brain, let's say that beer is the favorite interpretation of the word pint, well, that forms sort of a global resonance, and your experience is that you see letter string and something in the world comes to mind. And that's really what perception is. And in a theory like adaptive resonance, all this other stuff was there, and it can affect your performance, but it's unconscious, and it's not appreciated, and it's not encoded in memory. Oh, and at that point, you can discriminate real words like pint from pronounceable, what are called pseudo-homophones, a misspelled item build. You're able to match a word to a spelling, which you have to do for that discrimination.
What happens if it's got two meanings?
Well, you can, of course, toggle back and forth and appreciate either one meaning or the other, and I can come up with a priming experiment to make you reliably go one way or the other. But the truth of the matter is, the vast majority of time, ambiguous words are encountered all the time in English, and we never appreciate the alternative meaning. If I say there's a fly in here, we all have zippers, but nobody stops to think about that. You look for the interpretation of fly that is sort of contextually appropriate. And sometimes, everyone knows the person who points out ambiguity and like ruins conversation and makes puns. People can certainly do that. You can, by force of effort, look for ambiguity, but we normally don't. Normally we lock in and we move on. And so this theory sort of works as a theory of what might happen in spoken word recognition just as well. I'm not going to go slowly, but I did a similar demonstration with the word bagpipe, where you hear bagpipe and lots of stuff gets activated, whether it's phonetic features or what have you. It's going on through time, different phonemes are being activated and you're selecting it and then you're building strings. Ba turns into ba, turns into bag. At that point, you would think, hearing a word like bagpipe, bag would be perceptually appreciated. You would think, oh, the person is saying bag. But that almost never happens. You never actually jump to a conclusion that quickly. You're always lagging a little bit behind the signal, and when you get the P, bag is activated, but it doesn't really get much of a chance to hold on because you start building on it. And pipe comes along, starts building resonances. The only thing that really works is bagpipe, and you end up being really only perceptually aware of the compound word. And that's another example of what we do all the time. We have all these compound words where there are words embedded in longer words, and we almost never appreciate them perceptually. They might affect our data. If you watch somebody's ERPs, you might see that that word was momentarily available at some level. But consciously, we don't appreciate it. And that's what Grossberg's interested in. Okay, returning to what I'm talking about. This theory, adaptive resonance theory, provides a way for people who are interested in things like voice-specific learning to both have their cake and eat it too. You can make the following argument, that sure, we are able to encode voices, we're able to use spoken signals to activate lexical knowledge and store other stuff as well, but maybe we don't do that most of the time. Maybe the vast majority of the time, that information is there, it's part of that resonance process, but most of the time, we appreciate the linguistic content and we quickly move on to the next thing. And so even though voices could be encoded, they're not, and they don't affect data very much. And that's the position that McLennan, Luce, and colleagues have argued in what they call the time course hypothesis, and what I'm going to argue against today. So in a series of studies, what they've argued is that voice effects can occur in experiments like we do in the lab, but they really occur only late in the game. The first thing that happens in speech perception is that you activate the highly frequent units, phonemes, syllables, words, and that enters into quick resonance. And if you're successful, if that's all you need, and your perception is done, you don't really keep that resonance going, you don't store the superficial details that you might need if you're struggling. Imagine that you're listening to somebody with a heavy accent, and you're trying to understand what they're saying to you. Well, when you do that, you watch a person's lips, you listen attentively, they finish what they say, and you think for a second, and you sort of replay it in your head, and you're hearing their accent and sort of using it to intuit what they must be trying to say to you. And that's a really rare event that we actually need to zero in on somebody's manner of speaking to understand. What McLennan and Luce argue is that idiosyncratic details of stimulus, you hear a word at study, you do some activity for a while, then you get that word at test. Those superficial details might matter when a person is struggling to do the task, whether it's searching memory for is this old or new, or making a hard classification. You might be able to use those details to help you. But most of the time we don't. And what they've done are a lot of experiments, which I hate. For example, a lexical decision task where it's spoken words and you're discriminating words from non-words. If the discrimination is made easy, by having the non-words be very non-word-like, you don't really get any difference between same voice and different voice repetitions later in a study. You get a null effect, no voice effect at all. It's only if the discrimination is made difficult and people are responding more slowly that voice effects start to show up. And it's called the time course hypothesis because what they argue is that most of the time in the time course of processing, linguistic stuff does its work and it's done and you stop. But on a minority of trials that really only occur in the lab, we slow people down enough, we make the task so challenging that these perceptual details have a chance to come show their effect. Kind of the exact opposite of what I've learned. In another study, which is hard to see, they have people do a naming task where they either hear words and repeat them back right away, or they hear words, they wait a couple of seconds, and then when a light comes on, they say the word. When you're just doing straight up naming, there's no voice effect. When you do that delayed naming and you give a person time to sit there and hear the word in their head, you do get an effect. It's really hard to see. If I zoom in on it, there it is, it's tiny. So, McLennan, Luce, and colleagues have published about a half dozen, maybe 8 papers on this topic, showing that in all these different experiments, when processing is fast and fluent, you don't seem to see voice effects, but when it's slow and effortful, you do. I'm going to be a little bit of a jerk and do a micro critique of their work before I get into mine, because I hate these studies so much. One of the issues that comes up in these experiments is that they're really underpowered. And so I just don't like them from an empirical perspective. The classic study that everyone cites, McLennan and Luce from 2005, their experiment had 24 items that people heard in a study session, 12 words and 12 non-words. They only are interested in the words. In the second block, you get 12 non-words and those same 12 words. 4 of the words are new, 4 are same voice repetitions, and 4 are different voice repetitions. And that's the entire experiment. And these same papers, or this same stimulus set, is used in 4 or 5 of their articles. So it's a really tiny set. And it's usually not significant by items and that sort of thing. So I don't love the experiments just for their power. And one of the things that I want to do instead of today is a more powerful design. The other issue that I've struggled with a lot, and I'm going to come back to later, is that the task itself, I think, introduces a confound. Let's say your job is to discriminate spoken words from spoken non-words. And the manipulation that makes it either easy or hard is that the non-words are either real similar to words, so you have to listen carefully, or they're not similar at all. This is an actual example from their paper. An easy discrimination might be the word bacon as one of the stimulus words, and thus fudge as one of the non-words. If you're listening and making rapid lexical decisions for all of 15 seconds to do 12 trials, and you hear something that sounds like bacon, you can make a fast word response. If you hear thus, you can make a fast non-word response. And sure enough, I showed you, people are fast in the easy condition. The hard discrimination was bacon versus bake-off. It's identical up until the last segment. And these are being distributed in time because they're spoken words. So one of the things that they argue is that people only really show voice effects in the hard condition. Well, you only really have to listen to the stimulus carefully in the hard condition. So the encoding conditions aren't equivalent across the easy and hard conditions, which makes it, to me, an uninterpretable experiment. So we wanted to do a better job, and I'm going to get into what we've done. I'm going to skip over this. We use eye tracking, and we didn't use the visual world approach, but you guys are probably familiar with studies that show that eye movements to objects on a screen are very sensitive to ongoing speech processing. So, for example, a classic study by Tannenhouse, Alapena, and colleagues, a person might see a display like this with 4 objects on it, a beaker, a speaker, a beetle, and carriage. Carriage is the control item. The spoken utterance says click on the blank. And if it happens to be, let's say, the word beaker, what you see is that while people are listening to this is the time since the onset of the target word, whether it's any of those. If it's carriage, or if it's beaker, no one looks at the carriage. That's way down here. Early on in processing, the rhyme competitor might get a few looks, but really what you see is competition between two words that have the same onset. And it happens really rapidly in time. By about 400 milliseconds after the onset of the item, the person is fixating the proper object and they stay on it right to the end. And using this kind of a measure, Sarah Creel found that people in fact learn voices. If people are shown displays like this, and different objects are reliably spoken in different voices, so couch, for example, is always spoken by a certain person, what happens is that early on in the experiment, there's no benefit to the fact that that word is reliably spoken in one voice, but toward the end of the experiment, the last 20% of the experiment, people fixate the couch earlier as a result of hearing that person's vocal register.
So that says proportion.
It's, yeah, you turn the data into proportions of fixations to each object, and then you do
What's that 20%? How many trials were there?
a lot. And actually, that's one of the issues that I was worried about. People, it's hard to compare these tasks for that exact reason, actually, Simon. The tasks are different, lexical decision and shadowing versus click on the paradigms. And the repetitions are way out of control. So in McLennan and Luce, every item's heard once. And in Sarah Creel's, you heard it 20 times before you were in that last chunk of the experiment. So they're really not comparable. And one of the things that we wanted to do was, I'm going to use a French word now, a rapprochement, where we took these different paradigms and put them together and tried to get the best of them. So our question is, after a single exposure, like McLennan and Luce use, and like I've done in most of my work, a person hears a spoken word in a certain voice one time. Can we find voice specificity effects that emerge early in processing? Earlier than adaptive resonance says that you should see them. Will it be robust? Will it be early by anybody's reasonable measure of earliness? In the world of spoken word recognition, making word-non-word decisions to monosyllables takes about 700 milliseconds. Bisyllables, about 900 milliseconds. Can we show a voice effect before the word is over, for example? And what we did is experiment 1, I'm going to take you through in just a moment, and experiment 2 is a control experiment. So I can skip this and move straight on. We used a novel, old procedure. Lexical decision to spoken words and non-words, where we did not manipulate the nature of the non-words, we didn't make it easy or hard or do anything like that. We just let people behave. But we did it using a weird visual search type of procedure. The idea being that eye movements might reveal that a person is using voice information really early, whereas something like a button press, which is a rather late arriving measure, may mask that finding. To go back, so why did I show you the thing with pint and all the resonances building? The idea behind this research is that even if something like adaptive resonance is correct, you might be able to find evidence for voice effects really early, even if a person didn't perceptually appreciate them by the time all that resonance process is done. Eye movements give us a window into early processing. We used a new method, and so we built some things into the method that should always work. Lexicality effects, words versus non-words, word frequency effects, and voice effects. The first two we were sure would happen if our experiment was valid. The question is whether the third would come out. And this is just a little bit of detail that nobody cares about. In this first experiment, we had 48 people who made 120 lexical decisions to spoken words in 4 different voices. The words were manipulated in terms of word frequency, and were as well balanced as we could make it, but we randomized so all the words sort of get used equally. Then they took a brief break, and they do it again. 160 more trials. Some of the words are old in the same voice. Some are switched to a different voice of the same gender or the other gender. That didn't make a difference, so I'm not going to show you that. And some were just new words, which we use to estimate priming.
So Steve, you know when you do these experiments, do you have to worry about uniqueness points in your words and your non-words?
We do. And so what we do in these experiments, of course, is we make sure that every word is used equally often as the same voice repetition, as a different voice repetition. Because, yeah, if all you were looking at was just RTs and the words themselves were the critical measure, then uniqueness points are a problem. And that's why most people use monosyllables, actually. Because 98% of monosyllables aren't unique until they're done. What makes the task fun is the method. I'll skip to a schematic trial. So we're using the island. A person is sitting with the chin in a chin rest, and they see a fixation cross on the screen. They have to hold their gaze on the fixation cross for a second, and that triggers the onset of a spoken item. A word, let's say table, might be spoken, and what you can see, I hope, is that on the left side of the screen, somewhere there's a little blue plus, and on the other side of the screen, somewhere there's a little red X. The job of the participant is to keep their eyes on the cross, hear the item, and then decide, word or non-word, and find one of those two guys. One signifies word, the other signifies non-word in this first experiment. And it moves around. It's always on the same side of the screen. So they know that left is always non-word and right is always word, for example, for any one particular participant. But it behooves them, if they want to go fast, to decide as quickly as they can which way to send their eyes so they can go and find the thing and click them. So they click. In our general sort of overview of the method, in experiment 1, people did this task. We counterbalanced whether the response for word was on the left or the right. Half the subjects did lexical decision, like I've been talking about. The other half did semantic classification, where we got rid of the non-words, and they made decisions whether words represented objects that were bigger or smaller than a toaster. And they would just make their decision to the spoken word, go and click. They do that for a while. They keep doing it. They take a break. Then we do it some more.
Steve,
Yes.
why a toaster?
I don't know. And in fact, sometimes we have to drop trials because people can't decide. I think it's pretty obvious that a raccoon is bigger than a toaster, for example. But ASU undergraduates don't love that comparison. Bread box is what is sort of the classic, but no one knows what a bread box is. So, yeah, toaster. In experiment 1, people did their task, took a break, and then continued that same task. And we looked for priming and voice effects. In experiment 2, we simplified the design. We were worried, just to preview a little bit, that our nice results from experiment 1 might have reflected response priming, that you don't just remember the item, you also remember the response you made to the item. So in experiment 2, we crossed tasks. People either did lexical decision followed by semantic classification, or they did semantic classification followed by lexical decision. And what it meant, and the toaster thing reminds me of what we struggled with, we had to make sure that items could be equally often mapped onto the left or the right when we switched tasks. So we had to have items that could be divvied up. So we got rid of task priming, essentially, in the second experiment. We have 3 indices of performance, which I'm going to share in reverse order from how I'm going to share them in the data. Our most important measure, which I'll show you last, was that initial saccade. At what point in hearing the spoken word does a person decide to go for it, left or right? And is that affected by whether or not the item is being repeated in an old voice or a new voice? Our next measure was sort of a sanity check. How long does it take the person after they move their eyes off the initial fixation cross to find the little X or the plus? It's a simple search task in an empty field. Most of the time, people accomplish it in one saccade. Sometimes they miss a little bit but then they get another click. And our slow response time, our long arriving measure, was time to click with the mouse. And I'm going to go in reverse order. Experiment 1, lexical decision. What we see here, these are mouse click RTs, and you see that they're slow. It's not an easy task to find and click on this little symbol with the mouse. So people are pretty slow. The average offset of the word was at about 600 milliseconds, and so it's taking about a full second to get there from the offset of the word. And what you can kind of see is that not much is going on. A nice frequency effect, high frequency words are faster than low frequency words, which in turn are faster than non-words, so the experiment seems to work. The new items shown on the far left of that each set of 3 bars are always slightly slower than the old items, so we're getting a bit of a priming effect, but it's not really robust. No voice effect at all. It looks like there's a voice effect, but in fact it's not significant. So we got robust repetition priming, and we got robust repetition priming in semantic classification as well. New items, high frequency, low frequency, no frequency effect in semantic priming, by the way. But the voice effect, even though it looks like it's there, was not reliable. It was a tiny bit reliable with the mouse click in semantic classification, where people are a little bit faster for same voice repetitions than for different voice repetitions. But it's not, it's not an effect that you get excited. So what about moving a little bit earlier in time? Now, bear in mind, our logic here was that the last thing you do, clicking the mouse, all your processing is done, and if you're still getting a voice effect, that's sort of unexpected. What about finding the object? Well, once again, we see a nice priming effect, lexicality and word frequency effect in lexical decision. There's also a reliable voice effect. People are faster to find with their eyes the object when they heard an old voice than a new voice. And we also got that in semantic classification. It's tiny, but it's there. I'm not sure that the scale should really be from 800 to 1200, but it is. And so even in that intermediate measure, we're finding it. But what's really interesting, and most important to me, is that in our earliest measure, we see it as well. This is time to initiate saccades. And as I mentioned, the words, the average length of the word is actually 686 milliseconds, so just shy of 700. You can see that people are almost always heading off to the right or the left before the word is even finished. They're making their decision, and they're highly accurate. 90+% of the time, people go the right direction on the first saccade. There were 3 or 4 subjects that we had to drop from analysis because they always went to the right on their initial saccade, I think just from force of habit. But most people do this accurately. And what you can see is a nice frequency effect, a nice lexicality effect, and people are showing a really robust voice effect really early on. Under 700 milliseconds, earlier than the time for the object even finished being spoken. Semantic classification, which is a harder task requiring semantic decisions, they're still really fast. They make that decision, big or smaller, within about 650 milliseconds, and then their eyes take off. How long does it take to plan a saccade? 150 milliseconds. So figure that the decision is made about here, and then the eyes move there. So what we're seeing is an early voice effect, very early, much earlier than McLennan and Luce would expect. Pretty much before the words even finished being spoken, the fact that it was spoken earlier in that one voice, one time, allows you to make that decision faster, even if it's a semantic decision. This is an interesting tangent just for the visual folks in the room, because you're all visual cognition guys and gals. I don't understand this finding, but maybe we could talk about it later. One of the things that we looked at, because Mike Hout is just sort of a data slut and likes playing with spreadsheets, we looked at the velocity, like how rapidly the eyes move across the screen when they're you take off and then you land, how fast do you go? And one of the things that we found, and it's really kind of strange, is that velocity is higher for words than for non-words, which maybe doesn't surprise you. But in the study session, velocity was reliably slower than in the test session. Average saccade velocity is faster earlier in the study, and peak saccade velocity as well. So what's happening in the experiment is that people are moving their eyes off fixation sooner and finding what they're looking for sooner. But the actual motion of the eyeballs across the screen is slower. And I don't get that. And I'm really curious to know if people have found anything like that in any other studies, where as people build skill with the task, they actually slow down the ballistic eye movements. Because what I think is happening is that people are getting skilled at sort of finding the target in the periphery, and they're making more careful eye movements.
Do you think they're overshooting and doing long amplitudes?
I really
Less skills?
don't, because they're finding the target faster.
There's an influence too about like preceding fixation duration on saccade characteristics, right? That it not be part of the same phenomenon.
It could be, except that all they're doing is holding their eyes on every trial on a cross.
Well, yeah, but the fixation duration and how long they are on the cross
Oh.
is different, right? So I'm sort of wondering whether or not it would be the same phenomenon.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, that's a good thought. Like I said, it's just a tangent, but I thought it would titillate, this crowd in particular. We find it every time, so I'll come back to it. So basically, McLennan noted in 2007 the voice effects are usually not found in RTs, but final RTs being a button press isn't a really immediate measure. In a more immediate measure, and by the way, in EEG as well, you do see voice effects. So what we found was that we can find real early voice effects, the opposite of what they predicted. One problem with the experiment, and I already previewed this, however, is that people weren't just having repeated exposure to an item, they also are repeating the exact response to that item across study and test. So maybe we're getting some response priming, and maybe the voice is helping you remake the decision or remake the response that you made earlier, instead of really affecting perception. And so we did experiment 2, as I noted, where we crossed tasks in between. I'm collapsing across lexical decision and semantic classification just to get to the good stuff. This is late processing, so this is mouse clicks. And what you can see is that there's not much going on. There's a bit of a voice effect, but only for low frequency words, not for high frequency words. And there's really barely a frequency effect. The mouse click data is just noisy. But when we go to the earlier measures, finding the target, we still don't really see a frequency effect, which is interesting, unexpected, but we do get nice voice effects. People are faster to find the X and the plus on the screen if the word that they're hearing was in the same voice that they heard previously in the experiment, even though they're doing a different task now. And finally, our earliest measure of processing is time to initiate, and we see, once again, fast decisions being made and real strong voice effects. So the finding holds up across a task switch. I'm gonna skip some of this. So to summarize the data that we found, we can in fact get early voice effects using a lexical decision task like McLennan and Luce, but making it more sensitive to early online processing. We think that the initial eye movements sort of reflect the absolute minimum moment that the mind commits to a decision, either left or right. The question is, what does it mean for the time course hypothesis? And something that I didn't show you, but I'm going to tell you now, and something that took me a year to kind of deal with. We find these early effects. Everyone's happy. We're happy. Connor's not happy, right? However, we collected lots of trials. We got lots of power. We did the experiment as best we could. And one of the things that you might be wondering is, well, do the voice effects get bigger when people are in fact slower? What the time course hypothesis predicts is that when people are responding more slowly, the voice effects should get bigger and bigger. And so he said, sure, we're getting it in the aggregate, but let's do a correlation. Let's correlate how quickly the person is responding with the magnitude of the voice effect for any given item. Itself, when it's the same voice repetition versus that same word when it's a different voice repetition. I'm not going to show you scatter plots, but what we found every single time, and especially in those initial fixations, the first saccade data, was exactly the relationship that McLennan and Luce would predict. When people responded more slowly, the voice had a bigger effect. And so I was faced with a situation wherein my data argue against their theory, but my data also support their theory. And that screwed me up for a while. So the question is, what do these findings really mean? The notion that indexable variability should only affect perception when people are slow or processing is effortful doesn't seem to be supported. But it actually has a couple of different interpretations. If your first interpretation is that you should only get voice effects when processing is disfluent, or as I say on the screen, you won't get these effects when processing is fluent, then we contradicted that. You can get these effects even with real fast fluent processing. However, if the theoretical statement is interpreted a different way, that voice-specific priming will increase generally when processing takes more time, then we supported that. And so the question is, what does that mean? And as I just said, we found this even though I didn't show you scatter. Is anyone here familiar with the term response time scaling problem? Well, you, because we talked earlier. As you guys all know, RTs are sort of a funny measure, psychologically speaking. And one of the issues that I've really struggled with this work is trying to figure out what the proper null hypothesis is under the time course theory. As you guys know, RTs in psychological data are generally distributed by a roughly ex-Gaussian distribution, where there's a lower bound, you can't get any faster than a certain minimum, and then there's a modal response and then a long extended tail. What this means is that words that are by nature those words that generate fast RTs, so high frequency words, short words, concrete items, whatever it might be, if there's a word that generates sort of a fast RT most of the time, then anything you do with that word can only have a small effect. You can semantically prime it, you can repeat it twice in a row in an experiment, and it can still only speed up a little bit, because there's a logical minimum. But if a word is slow in its sort of RT, and then you prime it, you can change it quite a bit. And so effects in general, in cognitive psych, tend to get bigger. Any effect, a frequency effect, a priming effect, whatever it might be, tend to get bigger whenever RTs get slower. So how do we figure out the correct null hypothesis under the time course hypothesis? And what I did, and this seems like it's going to be complicated, but I'm going to go fast because it's not complicated. I did a bunch of Monte Carlo simulations with fake data. Here's top 7 or 8 lines of a spreadsheet. What I'm doing here, I'm going to show you a figure in a moment, is I took a random number generator and randomly generated numbers between 500 and 800, meant to be milliseconds. Did that 10,000 times. And then I defined those as same voice trials, and then for different voice trials, I slid it up between 550 and, in this case, 975.
Like the mean of the distributions, or?
I just changed the range. No mean, just pick a random number between this value and this value. And as you can see, in this particular case, the range is larger for the different voice items than for the same voice items. And I just generate these numbers in different ways, which I'll share with you in a moment. Then I just got the mean for the item by taking those two numbers and averaging them, and the voice effect by subtracting one number from the next. And bear in mind, there is no logical relationship between these two numbers for any given item. It's just randomly chosen. if I begin with really unrealistic assumptions, where I simply have a sliding window that goes from 500 to 800, and then it goes from 550 to 850. So the range is exactly the same for same and different voice items, and I just sample. Excel works. It samples nicely. You get values below the cutoff for the dark bars and above the cutoff for the light bars. It looks like a flat distribution because it is. If you take that mean for any item and the difference between the two, the difference score between two versions of the item, nothing happens. There is no relationship between those values at all. However, if you do a correlation where you just take the second number and correlate the second number with the subtracted value of the second number minus the first, you get a huge positive correlation. Just without any distribution information whatsoever, if you have a slow value, the likelihood that it's going to be far from the other value goes up. So there's a relationship between the speed of responding to half the stimuli and the effect that you're looking for. Now, that's not very satisfying because it's totally unrealistic. Another version of that same paradigm, still a flat distribution, but with greater variation. On the right-hand side, that's the spreadsheet I showed you at first. There's a bigger range for the different voice items than for same voice. With that tiny little change, you get a reliable correlation between the item mean, the average of two numbers, and the difference between those. You don't even have to just look at the second number. If you look just at the second number, you get that huge correlation again. So flat distribution is just assuming greater variance for the slower items, and you get this relationship to come out. So then I started getting more realistic. I'm not going to take you through all the steps because they're not interesting, but sampling from Gaussian distributions with different means and different variances, as shown there. Those are fake same voice and fake different voice values. You simply take the average for each item and correlate that with the difference between the two values per item, and that's what comes out. About a correlation of 0.3 across simulations. If you just look at the second item, it's much stronger, once again. If you assume that RTs are distributed in something close to X-Gaussian, drawing from a Weibull distribution, for example, with different means and variances, you can generate real nice fake data. You look at the correlation between the item mean and the voice effect, and it's positive, just like every other time. And if you just look at the second value, the same thing. It's even stronger. The most realistic distributions that we could choose from show that in every case, even though there's no logical relationship between those two numbers at all, it's just a random sample from a number generator, it's just likely that when you're behaving more slowly, when a number is big, the difference between that number and the other value is going to be big. Finally, the last thing, and this is straight from our paper, so forgive the wordy caption. I finally did it like a real psych experiment. Generated a bunch of values that were normally distributed with a mean and a variance, and then instead of randomly choosing again, I primed each of those items by having it change by a normally distributed value. So sometimes it could actually be a backwards priming effect, usually it was a positive priming effect, but randomly sampling each item once and then randomly modifying it to see what would happen, and the exact same thing comes out again. In fact, way more powerfully. In the more psychologically valid simulation, that relationship falls out much more powerfully. So the lesson to be learned from these simulations is that a correlation or an interaction that you find in an ANOVA where the lines are spreading apart, if RT is going up and your lines are getting farther apart, that's what Jeff Loftus calls a non-interpretable interaction. It's scaled to the value of your stimuli or the value of your subject. It's not showing you a bigger effect. it's actually the null hypothesis. So Gonzalez and McLennan write that despite the apparent plethora of evidence in support of highly detailed episodic representations, years of work in the laboratory of the second author, Connor T. McLennan, and then they say, and we suspect the laboratories of many other researchers as well, demonstrate that specificity effects are actually relatively difficult to obtain. They are weak and observed only under certain conditions, and we respectfully disagree. That's the end of my talk. The last thing I'll say is that having discovered that the proper null hypothesis, that this time course finding almost has to be true, is sort of a sad ending to a study. You work on something for a long time and you realize that the null hypothesis that you assumed all along was actually not scientifically valid. So you end up in a place where that whole line of inquiry sort of stops. Having said that, and the reason that I put this quote up at the very end, voice effects don't just show up in this task. They show up in children learning a language. They show up in people learning accents. They show up in reading. They show up in kids with cochlear implants. It's actually a really broad phenomenon at this point. It's been established over and over again. And so just because this particular paradigm kind of leads to a dead end, some sort of a fun story to tell anyway, the greater enterprise is actually quite compelling. And that's sort of why I put it. To thank my co-authors and the various research assistants and our funding agency, and I will take any questions that you may have.